So as I said, welcome to our June Ivy Talk. We are continuing to celebrate Juneteenth and the women of Riverview Farm today. We are excited to be hosting this Ivy Talk. I am Susie Farmer, the Education Director at Ivy Creek Foundation, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you all today. This evening, Miss Mariah Payne will be doing a talk on the club work of the Carr women. Before the Civil War, Black and white women joined social clubs. However, these clubs were often linked to the church or run by men. It was in the late 1800s that the women's club movement began, in which white middle-class women established national social and literary clubs. These clubs initially focused on self-improvement, but later expanded to societal reform. Largely left out of the women's club movement, the African American women's club movement emerged. Middle-class African American women's social clubs aimed to improve their condition and those of all African Americans. Mariah Payne works at the Ivy Creek Foundation as the education coordinator. She graduated in December of 2022 from Christopher Newport University with a bachelor's in history and a minor's in museum studies and psychology. She is a Hawkins descendant at Riverview Farm and a descendant of the Gillettes at Monticello. I would like to thank Mariah for all of her hard work researching this subject and helping us to expand our knowledge of the social justice work of the Carr women. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. This is being recorded and will be posted on our website in the next few days. Please mute yourself if you have not done so. We ask that you put your questions in the chat box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Mariah.
Thank you so much, Susie, for that introduction. I'm happy to talk with you all today. So today we're going to talk about the community work of Riverview Farm women, mostly talking about their club work, which consisted of women coming together regularly as a group to discuss different topics, share ideas, work in the community, and things like that. And I'm going to talk about the origins of a thing called the club movement, the women's club movement, and the origins of specific clubs that Riverview Farm women participated in. And there are a whole lot of clubs that they participated in, but I'm only focusing on a few. And then I'll look into the extent of their involvement and look at newspaper articles that kind of showcase their involvement. So here are the Riverview Farm women. We have Mrs. Mary Carr Greer, Mrs. Peachy Jackson, Mrs. Emma Witten, Mrs. Fanny Washington, Mrs. Hazel Agnew, and Mrs. Virginia Brown. Both Mrs. Greer and Mrs. Jackson remained in Charlottesville. Mrs. Agnew eventually moved to Farmville, Virginia. Both Mrs. Witten and Mrs. Washington lived in Wilmington, Delaware. And then Mrs. Brown moved to Plainfield, New Jersey. So today I'm really going to focus on Mrs. Greer, Mrs. Jackson, Mrs. Witten, and Mrs. Agnew. And that's because I couldn't really find much at this moment about Mrs. Washington and Mrs. Brown. And so I hope to, in the future, as I continue researching, learn more about their work in their communities. Okay. So the women's club movement began during the Progressive Era. So that was during the late 1800s. Women's clubs had existed before the Progressive Era and before this movement began, but they were typically associated with men or with the church. And during the Progressive Era, women joined clubs of like-minded women. And as it says there, it began as a self-help and self-improvement for women. And they would have social gatherings to speak about different topics, host literary clubs, so serve their communities through aid, so helping the sick and the poor, helping each other, and And then they would also encourage women to become educated. So they would have spaces for learning discussion, as I mentioned in those literary clubs, for example. So then it eventually evolved into self-reformation. So this meant fighting for women's suffrage and other women's rights initiatives. So clubs consisted mainly of middle-class women because they were the ones who had the time to go to club meetings. And it also consisted of local and national clubs. So there would be local clubs that met together, and then they would have local meetings and then form a national club that would then have meetings maybe every few times a year. And so they would attend national conferences. Um, and so before this designated movement, women's clubs were only local, and there were no national clubs for women to join. But then eventually, national and international clubs were created. So some examples of uh, women's clubs that were associated with the movement were Cirrhosis, which was seen as the first professional women's club, and this was established in New York in 1868. There was also the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NSWA, and that began in 1869. And then the General Federation of Women's Clubs, or GFWC, was founded in 1890. And at its founding, that club did not allow African American women to participate. So African American women were largely left out of the women's club movement. And so this leads to something called the Black Women's Club movement. So the Black Women's Club movement also began during the Progressive Era. Um, it became a separate entity from the Women's Club movement, but they had very similar ideals. Um, so, for example, they would fight for both women's rights and African American rights and the intersectionality of those. So, also the specific struggles that African American women faced. So they would call for suffrage, fighting against discrimination. They wanted to bring an end to lynching. And then as time went on, as we moved into the civil rights era, they called for desegregation. And I will talk more about specific Black women's clubs soon. So why did the Black women's movement begin? Through my research, I kind of found multiple reasons. And I'm sure there are multiple other reasons as, individual women had different reasons for joining the movement. So one of the reasons I saw was that during and after Reconstruction, more African Americans became educated, and education was highly valued in the community, and more schools for African Americans were opening up and becoming available. So I have a quote from a woman named Mrs. Fannie Barrier Williams, and she was an important leader and activist of the time. And I have her photo over here. She said that the rise was due to, quote, the organized anxiety of women who've become intelligent enough to recognize their own low social condition and strong enough to initiate the forces of reform. So she would say that because of more awareness, African American women were better educated about the barriers that they had to overcome. And they also learned more tools on how to fight back against the system. Another reason was wanting to change the large negative perceptions of African American women. During this time, Black women were seen as immoral, promiscuous, and ignorant. So Black women wanted to improve how they were seen and how they were perceived. So I have two examples, one by a Virginia historian named Philip A. Bruce. He was a historian during the 19th and 20th centuries, and he wrote in a very racist book, The Plantation Negro, as a free man, observations of his character, condition, and prospects in Virginia in 1889. He said that, quote, the average father and mother are morally obtuse and indifferent, and at times even openly and unreservedly licentious. And then I have another example from James W. Jack. He was the Missouri Press Association president in 1895. He wrote a letter where he said that Black women were, quote, prostitutes and were natural thieves and liars. And so this specific letter was seen as a catalyst that spurred participation for Black women to attend the first national conference in 1895, which I will talk more about later. And then lastly, I would say that because Black women were largely left out of the women's club movement, like I said before, many African American women weren't allowed to join white women's clubs. And so with nowhere to go, they had to advocate for themselves and create their own opportunities to improve their conditions. And so another quote that I have from Mrs. Fanny Berry Williams in her article entitled Women in Politics from 1894, she said, quote, we should never forget that the exclusion of colored women and girls from nearly all places of respectable employment is due mostly to the meanness of meanness of American women, and in every way that we can check this unkindness by the force of our franchise should be religiously done. And so I want to touch briefly on early Black women's clubs. Black women had clubs that existed way before the Progressive era, and they existed as early as the 18th century. So they had both female anti-slavery societies as well as female mutual aid societies. And so the first female anti-slavery society emerged in Salem, Massachusetts in 1832. And this won't be on this list on the right because it ends at 1830. And then there were also female mutual aid societies, which are most of the ones on this list. And so in these societies, women would pool their savings together to help each other, to help those who are sick, unemployed, having family troubles, things like that. And then by 1830, there are at least 27 female mutual aid societies in Philadelphia alone. So clearly, the amount of these early Black women's clubs were growing exponentially. And so the first Black women's club that we know of is the Female Benevolent Society of St. Thomas, which was a female mutual aid society that began in Philadelphia in 1793. All right, so now we're going to talk about the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, also known as NACWC, or NACW, National Association of Colored Women. I'll kind of go back and forth between those. And so according to the National Register of Historic Places, this is the oldest secular Black women's club still in existence today. And Mrs. Mary Cargreer and Mrs. Peachy Jackson were both members of this club. So this club was created in July 1896 at 19th Street Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. And that was the same year as Plessy versus Ferguson, which established separate but equal. And so this club was the unification of many different local clubs looking to create a national organization and unifying their goals and ideas so that their work is more effective and, people are able to create connections with each other. And so their goals and purpose, they kind of outline in Article 2 of their Constitution. It says that, quote, the object of this association shall be, by the help of God, to secure harmony of action and cooperation among women in raising the highest plane, the home, moral, and civil life. And through my research, I saw that the home was a very large part of their work. And there's a large belief that improving the home would improve the community. And so some specific work that they did, they nationally sponsored schools, which included schools for delinquents and children with mental disabilities. They also had hospitals, nurseries, kindergartens. They provided nurseries for children of working mothers, and they also created orphanages. And they would also work to preserve African American history. So one example I saw was that they would buy and take care of historic homes, such as the Madam C.J. Walker House, the Sojourner Truth Home, and Frederick Douglass's home, which I will also talk about. And here on the left side is their motto, which is lifting as we climb, which I will talk about. So here's a short timeline of the NACW, just to kind of show you. It's a little confusing, the history, so I just wanted to piece it together to show you how it came to be. And so in 1892, there was a local club called the Colored Women's League of Washington, D.C., and that was established in 1892. And then in 1893 was the creation of the Women's New Era Club of Boston. And over here you can see a picture of Mrs. Josephine St. Pierre, who was a member of the Women's New Era Club. And she also helped call for the first national meeting. And so then there again in 1895 is James W. Jack's letter. And then, like I said just now, Mrs. Pierre called for a national meeting in the Colored Women's Club newsletter entitled Women's Era. And so in this newsletter, they were very outraged by James W. Jack's letter. And so, like I said before, this spurred a lot of participation for Black women to attend a national conference. And that conference was held in Boston, Massachusetts in July, from the 29th to the 31st. And so that created the Federation of Afro-American Women. And then in 1896, the Colored Women's League, which was not part of the Federation of Afro-American Women, and then the Federation of Afro-American Women, they separately called for national meetings in DC, and they were actually right down the street from each other. And so they decided that, well, first, women from many local Black women's clubs sent delegates to the National Convention. And then they eventually decided that they should combine into one organization in order to be more effective, as I had mentioned before. And so they held a joint committee, both of these organizations did, and they decided to merge their organization, which led to the creation of the NACW. And then a little fun fact, Mrs. Harriet Tubman was a founding member of the NACW. And so then a year later in 1897, they had their first conference, which was held in Nashville in September. So the structure of this club, they had the national club, then they had state clubs, regional clubs, and then local clubs, which were associated with usually cities or counties, things like that. They also had national biennial meetings, some of which took place in Virginia. They had a national correspondence or newsletter, which was called National Notes. And this became the first official newsletter of the NACW. And it began as notes by Mrs. Margaret Murray Washington. Excuse my typo. And she was the wife of Mr. Booker T. Washington. And notes began at Tuskegee. They also had a national headquarters in DC, And then their motto was lifting as we climb. And I thought that Mrs. Mary Church Terrell had a nice quote that kind of explained the thinking behind their motto. And she said that, quote, "In no way could we live up to such a sentiment better than by coming into closer touch with the masses of our people." And, quote, "Policy and self-preservation would demand that we go down among the lowly, the illiterate, and even the vicious, to whom we are bound by the ties of race and sex, and put forth every possible effort to uplift and claim them." So this quote kind of shows that the belief that African American women of higher statuses should work hard to lift the status of all African American women rather than abandon those that they see are lower status. And so the NACW also grew a lot over time. So at their first meeting in 1897, there were 25 states that had sent 73 delegates and a total of 5,000 members. But by 1952, there were 44 states attending with 1,100 delegates and more than 100,000 members. And so the club also evolved and reformed as leadership roles switched out throughout the decades and goals changed. So next we'll get into the Southeastern Federation of the Colored Women's Club. This was a regional association that consisted of the states Alabama, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Virginia. And it originally began in Daytona Beach, Florida in 1919. It was temporarily organized in Daytona Beach, and then 6 months later, it was permanently organized at Tuskegee Institute. And then it was inactive from 1927 to 1940, but then it was eventually revived in 1940 at Tuskegee. So along with the national meetings, regional organizations would have their own conferences as well. So they had their own meetings as well. And then some of their prominent members include Mrs. Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the 8th president of the National Association, and then the first president of the Southeastern Federation, Mrs. Ida B. Wells, Mrs. Margaret Murray Washington, who was the founder and first editor of National Notes, and then Mrs. Greer and Mrs. Jackson. Then we'll get into the Virginia Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, which was organized by a woman named Mrs. Janie Porter Barrett in 1908 in Hampton. She called the clubs together and she became the first president, serving for 25 years. And she would often have meetings in her own home. So I saw a big project that they had. One of their first was raising funds for a school called the Industrial Home for Wayward Colored Girls. And this school, they raised funds for and purchased 150 acres of land in Peaks Turnout, Virginia. And this school was mainly for delinquent girls, but it also included girls who had nowhere else to go and who would have otherwise just been put in jail due to lack of space. And so the first girl entered the school in January of 1915. Eventually, the school was named after Mrs. Barrett, and it was called the Janie Porter Barrett School for Girls. So the Virginia Federation focused on many different things. They did church and missionary work, created retirement homes, focused on the jails, schools, poor, sick. They also wanted to help orphans and the overall welfare of children, improving their communities, and then also the aspect of self-improvement. So sewing, cooking, gardening, poultry raising, house cleaning classes. And so this photo that I have here is from the Virginia State Federation in 1921. And then I believe that this is a photo of Mrs. Jackson right here. So she would be right here in the center of the photo. I'm not 100% sure if it is her, but I think that it is. So I thought it was cool. Okay, so now I'm going to focus a little bit on the specific work that the Riverview Farm women participated in. Like I said before, they were part of the National Association, the regional and the state federations. And so Mrs. Peachy Jackson, she was the seventh president of the Virginia State Federation from 1954 to 1958, according to her obituary and also many of the sources I read. Um, and she was president when the Virginia Federation endowed the Virginia Room at the National Association's headquarters. And then she was also secretary of the Southeastern Regional Association during that time as well. And then Mrs. Greer, she was the assistant editor of National Notes. And then she was also president of the 5th District of the Virginia Federation, which included Charlottesville, Waynesboro, Crozet, Stantonville, Harrisonburg, and Stanton. And then also I saw that in a 1957 newspaper, she was the national chairman of the Committee of National Headquarters and Supplies. And then here are two newspaper clippings that I found. Newspapers would often have columns where members of that community would write what was going on in the community, and people could also, um, talk to people and tell them their stories that would end up in the newspaper. And so a lot of the club meetings I saw would appear in newspaper articles. And so this first photo is from a Virginia State conference that was held in Roanoke in 1961. And they are crowning Mrs. Federation. And here you can see on the far left is Mrs. Greer, and then third from the right is Mrs. Jackson. And then in the second newspaper, Mrs. Greer and Mrs. Jackson are part of 14 delegates that were representing Virginia at the Southeastern Conference, which took place in Albany, Georgia in 1961. And then in this article, Mrs. Jackson was listed as the second vice president, and this would have been after she had already completed her run as president of the Virginia Federation. And so Mrs. Greer is on the far left on the top row, and Mrs. Jackson's on the bottom right of the bottom row. So here's some more newspaper articles. The one on the left mentions Mrs. Greer, Mrs. Jackson, and Mrs. Theodosia Jones Lemons, who is the granddaughter of Mrs. Greer, attending a Southeastern Regional Conference in 1951 in Atlanta, Georgia. And then on the right side is a photo from Mrs. Lemons. And we're not quite sure when this photo was taken or where, but it looks like it is Washington, D.C., perhaps at a national conference, since they have the sign that says they are from part of the Virginia Federation. And so we have Mrs. Lemons right here, Mrs. Jackson here, and Mrs. Greer right here. So both of these clippings are from the same newspaper article. On the left, Mrs. Greer is third, or I guess she's right in the middle, in a line of women receiving awards as part of the Virginia State Federation in 1955. And in that article, it said that she had won the award for deputy, bringing in the largest number of new clubs. And then on the right side is Mrs. Jackson receiving the Lizzie Brown Burns Trophy at a meeting in 1955. And through my research, I learned that Mrs. Burns was a former Virginia Federation president. So yeah. And then on the left side, there's a newspaper article about a national conference that was held in Los Angeles in 1952, so for the National Association of Colored Women. And Mrs. Greer was able to attend along with a few other women from Charlottesville, who are more likely representing the Virginia Federation. And I think it's fun because it talks about some of the sightseeing tours that they went on, including the Grand Canyon, going to Chicago and Salt Lake City. Um, and then on the right, this article talks about Mrs. Jackson, who would have been secretary at the time for the Southeastern Regional Association, going to a conference in Jackson, Mississippi in 1959. And I also thought this was interesting because sometimes it will list what their forum discussions are or what kind of issues they're talking about. And so it said that in this article that there was a keynote speaker who was talking about the vital issues of our time. So these women were, staying informed about what was going on. They're encouraging each other to stay informed, join clubs, help out in the community, helping each other out, and things like that. So next we have the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association, or FDMHA. And so this is kind of part of the work I was talking about to preserve African American history. And so a little history about the Frederick Douglass House. So Mr. Douglass began purchasing his home, Cedar Hill, which is the name, in 1877. When he passed away in 1895, he left the property to his wife, Mrs. Helen Pitts Douglass. And then in 1900, the association was formed as Helen Douglass wanted to preserve Cedar Hill. Then in 1903, Mrs. Douglass passed away and left Cedar Hill to the association, but there was still a large mortgage on the property, and there had been a few fundraising efforts to, lower the cost of the mortgage. But eventually in 1918, the NACW got involved after the urging of the Memorial and Historical Association to help her pay off the remaining mortgage. And so through that, the NACW got involved and they helped restore the house, paid off the mortgage, and also created an advisory board. And then eventually in 1962, the house was added to the National Park System. So Mrs. Jackson was, according to her obituary, she was a member of the association, and she had been trustee and treasurer. In the future, I would like to know more about specifically what she did in this association, and also when she was part of the this association as well, because I wasn't able to find that at this point. So next we have the Phyllis Wheatley Club. And so a little background on Mrs. Phyllis Wheatley. She was born in 1753 in Gambia, and then she was captured and brought to the US in 1761. Eventually, she was sold to the Wheatley family in Boston, and they gave her an education. And then eventually in 1773, she published her first poem book entitled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. And she is recognized as the first Black woman to publish a book in the US. And shortly after this publication, she was emancipated and then eventually died in December 5th of 1784. So how did the Phyllis Wheatley Club form? So the first one formed in Nashville in 1895. It began by wives of prominent Black leaders in Nashville, and initially their goals were to support missions in Africa, as well as helping those in need in Nashville. And they also would advocate for better educational opportunities for African Americans. They wanted to improve the lives and status of African Americans, so they promoted very elite Victorian images for African Americans to follow. They also performed a bunch of different services, which included lodging for both women and the elderly. They would have youth programs, and they would also have political forums. So a little bit about the affiliation. So after 1900, actually, let me go back. Oh, the club had two separate models. So the first, the clubs could be independent, or they could be associated with the Young Women's Christian Association or the YWCA. However, if they were with the YWCA, they would have to be supervised by a white board. So that kind of limited, their independence. But eventually in 1931, the NACW formed its own Phyllis Wheatley department, which provided similar services to the ones under the YWCA. However, the ones with the NACW were not under supervised by a white board. So this newspaper article talks about Mrs. Greer hosting a Phyllis Wheatley Club in 1953. Some of their activities included planning a bond drive, and they were planning to sponsor a Little League team. And then a lot of the times you'll see in these newspapers, they'll kind of mention that they enjoyed like a meal together. So in this one, it says the meeting was adjourned, after which an enjoyable repast was served by the hostess. So they got to enjoy Mrs. Greer's cooking. On the newspaper article on the left was a meeting in 1954 at a person named Mrs. Thelma Townsend's house. So they started off the club with religious devotions. They reported on another successful bond drive. And then I thought it was interesting, Mrs. Greer actually spoke about the interracial aspects that she saw at a Virginia State Federation meeting in Harrisonburg. And so she kind of talked about how the integration meeting, how the integration meetings were encouraging, and that when she talked to people about it, it didn't seem like it would be a problem in that area. Then in the next newspaper from 1952, it talks about how this is the 30th anniversary of this specific Phyllis Wheatley Club. So this means that the Charlottesville Phyllis Wheatley Club started in 1922. And then for the newspaper article on the right, it talks about Mrs. Greer presiding over a meeting in 1954. This last Phyllis Wheatley Club article is from 1953, and it talks about the 31st anniversary of the Phyllis Wheatley Club. And Mrs. Jackson, who is listed as the Virginia Federation president, along with the City Federation president, who's listed as Mrs. D.V. Johnson, both spoke to the club. And Mrs. Jackson, they said, gave a small speech. And then once again, it said, after the program, a very delicious repast was served by the club to its guests. So these clubs were, very community focused. They were speaking about important issues, but, they were also entertaining each other, hang out with each other, catching up with each other, and just enjoying everyone's company. So next we have literature clubs or literary clubs. And so Black women began literary societies, and these were mostly for self-improvement. And then eventually they turned into avenues for racial self-expression and aspiration. And so this first club is called the Annie Gamble Coles Literary and Art Club. And it was named for a woman in the community named Annie Gamble Coles. So this first article talks about Mrs. Theodosia Lemons, who I mentioned before as the granddaughter of Mrs. Greer, hosting an informal tea at Riverview Farm in 1956. The club, it says, is celebrating its third anniversary. So that means this club started in 1953. And then Mrs. Jackson, once again, who's president of the Virginia Federation at the time, was a guest speaker, and she also installed the new officers. And then in her speech as well, she urged many Burley High School attendees to participate in colored women's clubs once they got to the college division. And then Mrs. Greer also spoke as well. So the article on the left is from a meeting that was held in March of 1953. Once again, Mrs. Theodosia Lemons presided, and it sounds like the club made plans for a fashion show. And then once again, Mrs. Jackson supported the club by giving her advice and offering her services as the state federation president. And then on the right is an article from 1953. Mrs. Lemons is actually listed as the president of the club at this time. And so they talk about making plans for a talent show and a dance. They made poinsettias for sale because this is during December. They made plans for a saving account for members of the club. And they also discussed the club's constitution. And then I thought this was really fun. They surprised Mrs. Jackson with a birthday party. And she gave a few remarks, and she said that she was very thankful for everyone. And then Mrs. Greer presented her with the club gift. And it also says that I think Mrs. Greer ran the punch bowl for the surprise party. So next we have the Taylor Art and Literature Club. I would also like to mention that in my future research, I would like to learn more about these specific literary clubs in Charlottesville. I don't necessarily know like much about Annie Gamble Coles, so I would like to learn more about her and things like that. So this is the Taylor Art and Literature Club, like I said before, and this article is from 1950. It says they're celebrating their 45th anniversary, so this club started in 1905. They honored Mrs. Annie Gamble Coles and Mrs. Susan Farrar. And it says that Mrs. Coles actually began this club, and that Mrs. Farrar hosted the first meeting, so that's why they were being celebrated. And then also in this article, it says that this specific club is the oldest literary club in Virginia and Charlottesville that's connected with the state federation. And then for the article on the left, Mrs. Greer and Mrs. Jackson attend a meeting in March of 1953. Once again, they had devotionals, they had a business meeting and a social hour. And they also celebrated the host's birthday. And then on the right, Mrs. Greer once again hosts the club meeting at Riverview Farm in 1954. She reported on the Virginia State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. Mrs. Jackson installed new officers. And I thought this was fun. Mrs. Greer served a delightful salad course with country ham, followed by ice cream and cake, mints, candies, nuts, etc. I just thought it was fun how specific they were about the meal. For the last literature club we're talking about today is the Thalian Art and Literature Club. And so Thalian means, or the word Thalia comes from Greek, and it is the Greek muse of comedy. So this seems to be a club related to either comedic art and literature. And so this first article is from 1953. Mrs. Jackson hosted in Charlottesville. They elected officers, so Mrs. Jackson became the treasurer. And they also, interestingly enough, they packed shoes and clothing boxes for brown babies. And I had to look this up because didn't know what this was, but the brown babies were babies born to African American soldiers and German women during and after World War II. And so the next article is from 1953. Mrs. Greer is listed as the president of the Valiant Art and Literature Club, and she also reported on the Southeastern Regional Conference that had recently taken place in South Carolina. Then we have some photos of the Valiant Art and Literary Society. So on the left is from a book entitled Charlottesville, an African American Community, by Agnes Cross White. And it says this photo was taken in May of 1958, and it features Mrs. Greer and Mrs. Jackson. So we actually have a photo that was given to us by Mrs. Lemons that kind of shows a better angle where you can see Mrs. Greer and Mrs. Jackson a lot clearer. All right, so now we're going to talk about a club that or I guess an organization that Mrs. Whitten was a part of. And so this was called the People's Settlement, and this was a settlement house, not a club. And so a little bit about the settlement movement. It kind of coincided with the women's club movement. So it also happened during the Progressive era in the 1880s, at least in the United States. And so they would provide service to European immigrants and the poor in urban areas. And if you've heard of the Hull House, that is one of the most famous settlement houses. And so the origins of the People's Settlement, it was established in 1901 by Mrs. Sarah W. Pyle at Taylor and Church Streets in Wilmington, Delaware. And so she said that she was inspired by the settlement houses in New York City that she went to after graduating, and had seen the settlement work there. And so she came back to Wilmington wanting to recreate that for her own community. And so it worked as a typical settlement house. Excuse the siren. And it eventually became a community haven for African Americans. So I definitely want to learn more about the African American or the work that they did for African Americans at the time and when this transition happened. And it said that it happened a little bit after African American families began migrating to Wilmington's segregated neighborhoods. And so, according to her obituary, Mrs. Emma Whitten was actually on the board of directors at some point of the People's Settlement. And I would love to learn more about when that was. So this first newspaper is entitled 20 Years of Community Effort. It's actually this one right here. And so it kind of just talks a little bit about Mrs. Sarah W. Piles. And it says that Miss Sarah W. Piles' vision fully realized through the cooperation and energetic work on the part of her friends who had faith in her theory that anything worthwhile warrants the energy it requires. The result is a building, a playground worth $100,000, on which the mortgage was burned last night. So I thought that was very interesting how much it had grown in such a short period of time, as this article is from 1922. Okay, so this newspaper on the left shows the first People's Settlement house at Taylor and Church Streets. And it said that they had rented a one room at first when it first started. And then, if I remember correctly, I believe it eventually grew into renting the whole house. And then on the right is the People's Settlement song. And so this newspaper on the left shows the new building, People's Settlement building that they were able to buy in 1922. And this was on 8th Street, and I believe that they are still there today in this building. And so with this move, they were able to expand their services. So they now had 32 rooms. And then they added even more programming. So they had dancing, music. They had a class called mental hygiene. And then they also had homemaking classes and had an orchestra as well. They also had classes for children to participate in, and they even hosted hikes and track meets, which I thought was really interesting. And so when it came to children, they would have programs such as manual instruction for boys and then domestic science for girls. And then even then, they also hosted men and women's clubs. And then, so in the future, like I mentioned before, I would like to learn more about when Mrs. Whitten served, and then the institution's transition into serving the African American community. So now we have a club that Mrs. Hazel Agnew participated in. She was a member of the club according to many newspapers I saw, and as well as her obituary. And so Mrs. Agnew had moved to Farmville in Virginia to teach in the Prince Edward County school system. And she did that for over 40 years and then eventually retired in 1959. So that means that she started teaching there as early as 1919. And she was part of the Martha E. Forrester Council of Women. So a little background on Mrs. Forrester. She lived from 1863 to 1951. And a lot of this information I got from the Moton Museum, which you should definitely visit and learn more about. And so she was born Martha Ellen Sampson in Richmond, and she taught in Richmond public schools. Eventually, she married into the Forrester family, which was a prominent family in Richmond at the time. And then after her husband passed away, she moved to Farmville with her daughter. And that's where she began the Farmville Council of Colored Women in 1920. And so this club was composed of Black women from Farmville who wanted to work to improve opportunities for African American education, bringing the community together, helping those in need, and then also improving home life for women and African American families. And then they also advocated for the creation of the Farmville Elementary School in the 1920s. And like I said before, if you would like to learn more about this school in Farmville, which became one of 5 cases taken to the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board, you should definitely visit the Moton Museum in Farmville. And so this club raised $1,000 to help pay for the auditorium at the school. And so Mrs. Forrester was president of the council until she passed in 1951. And then eventually the council changed its name to Martha E. Forrester Council of Women. So some of the newspaper articles, this shows the members of the 1947 council together. And I mentioned Mrs. Hazel Jackson Agnew. Sorry. And Mrs. Hazel Jackson Agnew, who is labeled here as Mrs. Hazel Jackson as part of the club, but she is missing from the photo, unfortunately. So I added in this photo on the right to show what she looked like. And this was from her obituary. All right, so lastly, we have the Union Ridge Missionary Circle. So they still had clubs that were associated with the church, like early women's clubs. Though many of the clubs I talked about they weren't focused on religion, but they had religious like devotions and services kind of in the club. There were still clubs that had religion as the focal point and missionary work. And so the Union Ridge Church and Hydraulic Mills, which is right up the road from Ivy Creek, had their own Union Ridge Missionary Circle, which Mrs. Greer was a part of, as well as Mrs. Lemons. And so this one on the left shows a meeting held at someone's house in June of 1954. They appointed delegates for another association. And then it says Mrs. Ethel Nicholas who was the principal of the Albemarle Training School, which is also in right up the road from, or was right up the road from Ivy Creek. She was the principal right after Mrs. Greer. And then it says, like I said before, Mrs. Greer and Mrs. Lemons were in attendance at this meeting. And so the article on the right talks about the circle meeting at Riverview Farm in 1953. They made plans for some sort of event in the spring. They paid their monthly dues. They offered prayers for a sick member. And then once again, Mrs. Greer served dinner for her guests. So here are my sources. I hope that in this presentation you learned about how the women's club movement fostered community for Black women, though obviously they were going through very horrible times like Jim Crow and civil rights. African American women and the African American community in general were, fostering a community space where they could rely on each other and they could enjoy each other's company, eat together, entertain each other, find places of joy, turn to each other for help as well, and then, continue to fight for their rights and for civil rights. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mariah. You have expanded our knowledge and given us even more appreciation for these amazing women. So thank you very much. All right, folks. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Trying to find my notes to say thank you to you all. Thank you, Mariah, and thank you for this interesting and informative talk. Thanks to each one of you all for spending your time with us this evening. We hope that you enjoyed it and learned a lot. If you would like to support the work we are doing at Ivy Creek Natural Area and Historic Riverview Farm, please consider making a donation today. And again, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your evening.